everyone. Good evening. I will put my sweater here. Thank you, Father Joya. Thank you to St. Thomas for having me, for having us, for hosting this conversation. I've learned a lot, and I've been really excited to hear about different examples from other states and from other parts of the world. I'm aware that I'm the person who stands between you and this being done, and the next tip at 8, I think. So I won't keep you too long. I indeed, as Father Joya said, I live across and uptown. I teach and live at Union Theological Seminary in Morningside Heights. I'm an ethicist. I do a lot of historical work. I'm interested in making available a kind of a wider set of resources to think with ethically, to unearth some examples of how people have identified critical questions in their context, so we might be able to use their examples in our own context. And so today I will indeed talk about Bayard Rustin. He was a New Yorker, a Quaker, and one of the most important activists of the 20th century. And if you've heard of Rustin, it's likely because he organized the 1963 March on Washington, or maybe you've seen the Netflix movie that came out about him last year. I will fill in just a bit of biography and talk about a lesser-known moment of his activism here in New York City. So I won't be talking about church, but I will be talking about religious contemplation and how that is intimately connected to activism, and use him as an example for that. So the briefest introduction. Bayard Rustin was born in 1912, he died in 1987, and he was at the heart of justice movements in the 20th century. In the 1940s, he innovated various kinds of activism that would become mainstays of a later national movement, including in the 40s sit-ins, multi-city marches, and bus protests. In the 40s, he toured the country and trained thousands of people in nonviolence. In the 1950s, he became a key advisor to Martin Luther King Jr., and Rustin helped to conceive of an important infrastructure of the civil rights movement in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. Rustin's extraordinary capacity to innovate protest was exemplified by his leadership of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which forever changed mass protest in the US. He then advocated for a shift from protest to politics. He envisioned a multiracial progressive coalition that could end poverty in the United States. Rustin always situated the Black American freedom struggle as part of a global movement against white supremacy. He frequently traveled to Asia, Africa, and Europe, where he championed refugee rights and urged countries to forsake militarism and nuclear weapons. In short, Rustin was instrumental to US freedom movements and an advocate for peace and justice around the world. Increasingly emphasized now, which is so important in talking about Rustin and understanding his contributions, is how he was repeatedly undermined by other people in the movements of which he was a part. And he was really remarkably connected with various different social movements and understood and saw their and advocated for their interconnection. Rustin was a gay man who was out generations before Stonewall, but he was undermined repeatedly by cruel homophobia at key points in his career. And so I think the movie does a really lovely job of emphasizing the fullness of his humanity, which included his sexuality and his love for people, and also depicts him as a fully activist and sort of fully rich human being. So yes, Rustin and Netflix and otherwise is being increasingly celebrated, but missing from almost every account of his life is the significance of religious practice and belief to his radical theorizing and activism. So biographers, even the movie, will mention that he was Quaker, but they don't do anything to talk about what that means and why that's significant. And so I'll do just a little bit of that today. Rustin was Quaker. This is downtown, right? He was a member of the 15th Street meeting here in Manhattan. And he was called on by national and international Quaker organizations to speak authoritatively about what it meant to be Quaker. So he really was Quaker. If you come away with nothing else today from my talk, please come away with this. Rustin's practice of attending silent gathered meeting, I'll talk about what that means and what that looks like in a minute. Rustin's practice of attending Quaker meeting was integral to his activism. Contemplative practice was an anchor to his work in the world, to his engagement, you might say, with civil society. So I don't have enough time, and the Knicks are playing soon, to talk about the history and theological reasons for Quakers' habit of silent meeting, but I'll say just a little bit. The Religious Society of Friends, also known as Quakers, those who call themselves Friends, arose during the Civil War amidst a flurry of schisms among English Protestants. Quakers assert that each person has that of God in her, also known as the inward light of Christ. You might have heard the phrase inner light, also known as the seed, the life, and the power of God. I went to a Quaker college, and we would strangely chant, fight, fight for the inner light. Not quite getting it. The spirit that resides in each person underscores a fellowship or unity that is the proper relationship among human beings. This understanding of the light has motivated Friends' historical engagements with social justice movements, including abolition, women's rights, pacifism, civil rights, and immigrants' rights. For Rustin, who attended unprogrammed meeting, Quaker worship was communal, but silent and bare of ritual. What Quakers call meeting for worship, they sit silently together and wait upon the Spirit of God, who may prompt a person to speak and share vocal ministry with the community. In the earliest meetings, and in many meetings today, there was not a minister. Early Quakers cheekily asserted that they didn't do away with ministers, rather they did away with the laity, for anybody can minister. Each friend, man or woman, and often women were and are, moved by the Spirit and so had the prerogative to speak or to give public ministry. Meeting, then, is not merely an indicator that a group was or is friends. Rather, meeting is a practice of making them friends. Many Quakers assert a connection between silent contemplation and the more noisy social action. So Rufus Jones, who is a foremost Quaker scholar and a founder of the American Friends Service Committee, so here we have someone who's doing both, insisted that repeated contemplative practice generated a trust in the light that spurred what he called a radical openness to others, what others might call activism. Jean Toomer, who was a poet and essayist and novelist during the heyday of the Harlem Renaissance, was also Quaker, and Toomer underscored the connection between silent contemplation in meeting and activism. So Toomer wrote this in 1940, which I love, and I love for my students to read it because it's talking about young people, and he's talking about young people in the 1940s, but it sounds like young people today. So Toomer writes, when compared with bodily action, what could seem more inactive than waiting for God? The modern world asks, where will that get you? Young people say, we want action. Yet, as we have seen, Toomer continued, it was precisely through this and other apparently inactive means that early friends came into a power of whole action that surpasses anything we experience today. Toomer wrote, we say we are activists, but often we lack the spiritual force to act effectively. Toomer continued, they said they were waiters and frequently acted as moved by God's light and love. I think we are in this age of decreasing inner action, of ever-increasing outer activity, that we have a profound lesson to learn from those early friends. So that was Toomer writing to other Quakers, asserting to them the kind of role and connection between contemplation and activism. And not for nothing, he was a mentor to Rustin as well. So Toomer underscored how spiritual practice, and for Quakers this entails waiting, was always connected to, prepared them for, and sustained them in activism in the world. And so for Rustin and many other Quakers, peace testimony was and is an integral part of their identity as friends. So from the earliest days, Quakers have insisted that shared humanity, each person aglow with light, means that peace building should be a priority for communities. The peace testimony has taken on various articulations over hundreds of years of Quaker practice, and so I'll talk about one very specific example of what this looks like for Rustin in New York City in June of 1955. And in June of 1955, for Rustin, the peace testimony took the form of not participating in civil defense drills. Now, you might, for those of you who don't know the history of civil defense, that's fine. You probably actually do know it. Civil defense preparation took a lot of forms in the 1950s. Most well-known are the duck and cover drills that happened in schools across the country. So where children practiced what should be done in the case of a nuclear attack. I grew up in Canada. My mom did those in schools in Canada. The students dive under the desk and cover their heads. In 1954, the country decided it would organize a day each year in which entire cities would practice a version of duck and cover, and this was called Operation Alert. And in June 15th, 1955, there was a full-scale dress rehearsal of the Civil Defense Organization. So this happened in a number of cities across the country. For example, in Washington, D.C., President Eisenhower and thousands of key executive department personnel were evacuated from D.C., and the public across the country was asked to cooperate by going through the motions of a real attack. In New York City, the civil defense staff underscored the massive destruction that a hydrogen bomb would inflict. They warned that during the attack, an estimated 3 million New Yorkers would be killed and 2 million injured. Less than half the city would survive. So take it seriously. This is what's at stake, they were saying. Well, a collection of New York pacifists, Rustin organized the protest, he was among them and organized the protest, gathered for a full day's program of activities to, as they said, raise clearly the question of civil defense. The group included Protestants, Catholics, Dorothy Day and Eamon Hennessy of the Catholic Worker were among the group, and people of conscience, that is, people who didn't identify religiously. They held lectures and shared lunch. Rustin was the prime organizer, as indicated by the meeting for worship, which preceded the planned action. So ahead of the prescribed time for the drill in the afternoon, a number of the activists set off for City Hall in a protest of what they called the whole war program of which civil defense is a part. They brought a letter to the mayor that explained, quote, "Such publicized civil defense tests help to create the illusion that the nation can shield people from the war's effects. We can have no part in helping to create this illusion." They handed out pamphlets in City Hall Park that explained their protest that they were about to undertake to the public. They said, quote, "We will not obey this order to pretend, to evacuate, to hide. In view of the certain knowledge that the administration of this country, that there is no defense in atomic warfare. We know this drill to be a military act in a Cold War to instill fear, to prepare the collective mind for war. We refuse to cooperate," end quote. As the time approached when the fictitious bomb would fall, sirens went off in the city, and people were supposed to be in the places they were supposed to be, not sitting in the park. And this group of activists gathered at City Hall Park, and they sat on benches. That was their protest. And as soon as the sirens went off and they were sitting on the benches, police arrested them, arrested Rustin and 27 others for failing to obey an official order during the air raid alarm as part of the New York State Emergency Act. The penalty was a year in prison. In a later explanation of the group and its effort, Rustin underscored that, quote, "We believe such drills serve primarily to condition the public to accept and expect war instead of demanding peace and working for it." He and the group explained, quote, "We live in an age obsessed with physical power. In action, we have denied the power of spirit. So great is our obsession with physical power that we are prepared to endure extreme centralization, increased conformity, thought control, and loss of our freedom to achieve and protect that power. The question is, do we have the wit to prevent ourselves from being sucked into this whirlpool of self-destruction? The judge gave everyone arrested a suspended sentence. The judge didn't want the activism to get more attention. The activism did grow, however, against civil defense, and the drills were finally abandoned in 1962. So Rustin was a lead organizer of this protest that bears the hallmark of his religious practice. The fact of civil defense drills may seem almost absurdist to our contemporary selves, and yet what Rustin and others were resisting was the conformism that they saw as increasingly characterizing modern life. They were particularly concerned, and that they had this concern that it could have been otherwise is really hard to imagine, I think. They were particularly concerned by the massive and swift growth of the American military, which had taken an outsized portion of the federal budget. That hadn't always been the case, but they were seeing in the early 50s that this was happening. So something as simple as sitting in the park was saying no to militarism, no to a vision of the world that premised our relationships on fear and threat. Sitting in the park that day was refusing to participate in preparing for a nuclear attack. It was refusing the military buildup that presumed people's primary agency was to hunker down. The simple act of sitting in the park was also a reminder to the protesters themselves that they said no. It's a small and crucial thing to recognize that refusal is an important moment for people to remind themselves of who they are. It's a practice that says, this is a line that I draw, and this is what my values are. It was, as they said, a refusal to get sucked into the whirlpool of self-destruction. For Rustin, the protest was an assertion of the power of the Spirit, an assertion in the power and value of coming together to cherish theirs and their neighbors' humanity. In a later report about the protest, all of these groups to which he was a part in the 1950s, they all loved to print reports, which is wonderful as someone who does historical work because there's a lot of material to read through. And so in one very kind of lovely report where they give the whole account of this protest and what happened, there's a section, there's a pull quote, so emphasizing the significance of the point, that there's a pull quote from a lecture that Rustin had written years earlier about life in the United States after the US had dropped two atomic bombs on Japan. And Rustin characterized the situation after Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the kind of spiritual work that had to happen. And this was what the protesters in 1955 were calling on again. And so on your handout, it's the first sort of block quotation that I share. And Rustin had written again, he wrote this in 1948, that in the wake of the United States dropping two atomic bombs, that many formerly trusting men, observing the manifestations of depravity today, have begun to question whether that spark of God in each of us is not all but completely smothered. The spark, the potential, is indeed still within us, but in our reliance on violence, we have misused our energies and sapped the strength from our moral muscles. As an ethicist, I love that. He continued, indeed, only a miracle can save us, and that is the miracle of opposing injustice everywhere, first of all, in ourselves. It is the miracle of depending upon the power of good to overcome the power of evil. It is the miracle performed when we no longer believe that Satan can cast out Satan. So as your congregation considers how to best be engaged with the world around you, with your neighborhood, with your city, with our city, I encourage you to think with a handful of questions that Rustin consistently asked himself. What is your practice? How does it form you? What sorts of questions does your practice prepare you to ask? What does your religious practice require in terms of how you should be in relationship with your community? How do you build strength in your moral muscles? I have certainly been thinking a lot about these questions in an urgent way in the last week. As I mentioned, I live and teach at Union Theological Seminary, up across and uptown, which is in Morningside Heights. All of those of us who teach there live there as well, to model for our students what urban ministry looks like. We live in the city. And last week, I was out on Tuesday night when the NYPD took over our neighborhood. Columbia's president had called the police to remove a group of students who had occupied a building on campus. They were part of a larger protest to call for a free Palestine and for Columbia to divest from its investments in companies that create weapons. Earlier that day, it was last Tuesday, it was a beautiful spring day, it turned out. There had been helicopters hovering over campus, which is over our neighborhood all day. I know because I was out with a friend having lunch in Riverside Park, and we couldn't hear each other talk because there were 3 helicopters and they were just constant. Around dinner time, it felt like police started to arrive in larger numbers. There have been since the fall kind of barricades near the main 116th and Broadway. That main gate could kind of come up and down. They were coming back. My husband was going out that night to dinner downtown, and he was walking to the subway, and he called me to say it seemed like the police were shutting down Broadway, which is just strange. When it was 7:30 last week, and time for me to walk the dog, because every night you have to do that, I called friends who are colleagues, and like I said, we all live at work, and we walked out of our building with my dog to see our neighborhood transformed. The police had barricaded 7 blocks and 2 avenues. We weren't even allowed on the sidewalks. Buses were rerouted, the subway skipped 116th Street, businesses closed. Police were everywhere. The helicopters left, but there were drones overhead, full-size buses ready to cart students to jail. And the buses are still there. Luke and I were walking today, and the buses are still parked right in front of Riverside Church, no less. And as we walked around, police repeatedly told us we couldn't enter parts of the neighborhood as they continued to erect barricades. Now, to be clear, if Columbia's president called the NYPD to her campus, where we were wasn't campus. It was the city. It's where we live. And the show of police force was chilling. Those of us who were out for a walk that night were a diverse group of colleagues, my friends on the faculty. They were a Zen priest, a woman who wears hijab, a Black woman, an Asian woman, and a queer couple. In other words, we were a group of people who aren't always made safer by the police. And there were hundreds and hundreds of police. I asked probably 20 times how many were there, and they wouldn't tell me. But there was a literal phalanx of police in riot gear who stood at the corner of 113th and Broadway, right in front of Broadway Presbyterian, a church that feeds the neighborhood with its soup kitchen before and during and after the pandemic. The NYPD brought a Bearcat, which is a military gray tactical armored vehicle. We saw it go into the building, and then when they were done at Columbia, the NYPD drove it 20 blocks up Amsterdam Avenue to City College. And that was Tuesday night. The next night, Wednesday, I got a series of harrowing photographs and videos from my 18-year-old son, who's a first year at UCLA. So when LA riot police began amassing on his campus, he was among the thousands of students who gathered to stand between police and protesting students who were also calling for a free Palestine. And so he showed up at 7 p.m. just to stand between so the police couldn't get to. And so the middle photo on my handout is a photo he took at 3 a.m. The LAPD, like the NYPD, used sound cannons, but the LAPD shot rubber bullets at students, which is in LA, which it seems as though they didn't do here. So I'm not sure how you feel about police response to student protests, but I'll say to you what I said to 2 NYPD lieutenants among the many people I spoke with over the last week, including today. There were more police on my street, that these are unarmed students. And I said, surely if a university president calls you and you're good at your jobs, you don't need hundreds of police in riot gear and military-grade vehicles to arrest unarmed students at their school. And so police remain an outside presence in our neighborhood, and I was caught up short by that. 2 friends and I were caught up short by that, and by what we're hearing and reading about police around the country. And so we started a simple practice for ourselves and invited to others to join. This is not anything in place of other kinds of activism. This is one small thing that we're doing every day, and that is every day at 5 o'clock, we take a walk around our neighborhood. to say no to excessive police, and to say that we support our students. We come from different aspects of the Christian tradition. We're Muslim and Buddhist and Jewish. We're non-observant and a-observant. We're professors and students and community members, friends, spouses, kids. There are dogs that come. In other words, we come with a different set of reasons, but what we share is a commitment to repeated practice. We're committed. I think today was our 7th day. Can that be? We're committed to doing so until excessive police have left, and we carry signs to show support for students who have been arrested and to assert that we don't want excess police. We also do it to remind ourselves that excessive police are not normal, and we don't want them to become normal in our neighborhood, for our students, for our neighbors. It's been a week of walking, and there have been different people every day, a steady core who come daily. And so we're all saying no, but we're also saying yes. We're building community. We're doing something repeatedly with a group of neighbors that's also a practice of valuing each other. And so for you at St. Thomas, as you are considering with what engaging with civil society, what all of the ways you can do that and what it means for you, I'll conclude by repeating the series of questions that you might find useful. What is your religious practice? How does your practice form you? What sorts of questions does your religious practice prepare you to ask? What does your practice require in terms of how you should be in relationship with your community? And what can you do to strengthen your moral muscles? Thanks.